Yeah, it's a two-day Parisian getaway that includes dinner and a show. After getting down to business at the Elysée Palace, Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron off to dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant that's at the Eiffel Tower before the U.S. president stands as guest of honor at the reviewing stand of Friday's Bastille Day military parade. Unlikely when you remember that, well, I guess you could call it almost a hostile handshake when they first met a month ago on the sidelines of a NATO summit. At this point, any escape may seem worth it for a White House embroiled in an ever-growing Russia collusion accusations. But the question does beg, what do these two leaders have in common when they differ so much on policy, from everything from trade to climate change? The centerpiece of that visit, Friday's parade, which commemorates the 100th anniversary of the United States entering World War I, a turning point in history when the U.S. irrevocably overtook Britain as the planet's lead superpower. Does Trump's presidency signal, well, an end to that willingness to lead? And how do nations such as France rethink their own place in this changing world? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Donald Trump's visit to Paris with Stuart Haugen, former chair of Republicans overseas in Paris. Welcome back to the show.
That's Republicans in France, by the way, not overseas.
Oh, my mistake. Republicans in France.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, by the way.
All right. Also with us, Lex Paulson, who lectures in rhetoric and human rights at Sciences Po, who campaigned for Emmanuel Macron. Thank you for being with us.
Nice to be back.
Welcome back as well to George Kuzmanovic, spokesperson on defense and foreign policy for the left-wing France Insoumise party.
Good evening.
Nice to see you again. And we welcome as well public relations consultant Zoe Reyners.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, they address the press from the presidential palace. Let's cross to our own Douglas Herbert for more. Doug, the biggest sticking point between these two gentlemen, climate change. And we heard from Donald Trump say at one point, we'll see what happens.
Exactly. You know, I sat through that press conference, just got out of it, and you might be able to see behind me, I'm not sure, Donald Trump actually saying goodbye, leaving right now, at least, well, he'll be going to dinner, obviously, with Emmanuel Macron, but stepping out of that press conference. That was the one sort of glimmer that everyone's sort of eyes sort of opened up, and there was that flash that went through the room among all those reporters out there. Could he be alluding to something? Trying to read a little bit into that statement. He basically said, with respect to those Paris climate accords, we'll see. Leaving open the possibility, could he change his mind? He didn't say he was about to change his mind. We're not there. He didn't say he's about to back down on anything. Still sticking to his position, but leaving at least open the possibility of perhaps modifying that position in some respect. Otherwise, Francois, general impression is that it was a press conference in which most of the positions which we heard during the G20 summit, really sticking to those. Each side staying really on message on the same talking points, whether we're talking about the fight against terrorism, whether we're talking about cybersecurity, whether we're talking about fighting online propaganda. There was no major breakthroughs on any other front. We did obviously have that question on a lighter note about Donald Trump's comments about Paris no longer being Paris, and his friend Jim warning him off from ever going there, and he sort of went back on that earlier statement, saying Paris is a beautiful city and that he will be back, in almost Arnold Schwarzenegger-like tone. I'm coming back, he said. So that was the lighter note of the press conference. But on a lot of the basic issues, it really was the message that was coming across loud and clear, were that these were two men, pragmatic, who had made that pragmatic decision to work together, to talk together, in the full knowledge that they have some very major disagreements on some very big issues, notably climate change, but that they're going to keep this dialogue going.
Doug, we did get that domestic policy question. Donald Trump telling the press conference that from a practical standpoint, most people would have taken that meeting being the one that Donald Jr. took with a Russian lawyer in June of 2016.
Not only sidestepping the question a little bit, he called it opposition research. This is a narrative we've heard in recent days, that anyone would have done this in his place. He also cleverly framed it, if you will. It would be interesting to know which advisor told him to put it this way, saying that it wasn't a Russian government lawyer that he met with, but simply a Russian lawyer. And that would be a key sort of way of rephrasing this issue, because the whole difference between whether it was just a Russian lawyer that his son met with or a Russian government lawyer, that's all the difference when investigators are looking into the possibility of his campaign team having possibly colluded with a foreign national or a foreign government, specifically Russia. That wording would be key. So if it's just any old lawyer, they have a stronger case to make. No big deal. As you said today, press is making a whole big deal of this, sort of blowing it out of proportion. But I can almost guarantee you, Francois, that regardless of those words today, this issue isn't going away, and that Donald Trump did not lay this issue to rest. If anything, he probably raised a few more questions today about what he was told as well, about the nature of that meeting and exactly who he met with.
Douglas Herbert, many thanks for that update on that joint press conference there from the French presidential palace. Let's turn to our panel now. What will you take away from this press conference, Stuart Haugen?
I think the most striking thing is the degree to which both men are attempting to present a common face. We're open, we're working together, this is going to continue to develop. And I think I don't think we'll see any more of Macron's silly handshake gestures and stuff. I think he understands that playing hardball with Donald Trump is not a winning game for France nor for himself. I think Donald Trump understands that France is our oldest ally and continues to be a great ally. I think we've seen a maturation of the relationship in a very, very short time.
Yeah, it's the third time that they've met. Lex Paulson?
Look, I mean, it's no longer the case that Macron has anything to win politically from appearing to be confrontational with Trump. I mean, in his first weeks of the presidency, there was a political upside to seeming to assert French power in the face of American president who's extremely unpopular in France, and now it's no longer the case. In fact, he is sort of taking the place that the British once had of being the privileged power in Europe who could talk reason or open a line of communication. The fact is that Trump only respects one thing, and that's military power and shows of strength. And Macron, in this wonderful parade tomorrow, will be offering Trump a spectacle of the only kind that he seems to find credible.
My silence is not agreement with you on this issue of military power. I think he respects power. I think he respects strength, leadership with strength. And I think that he is seeing that Macron was brought to power by the demands of the French people for change, just like he was. Now, very different waves of change. The vagues sont différents, but I think it's very important to note the French are demanding change. Now, how they're going to get there with a group that's Macron and a bunch of anarchs, I'm not sure exactly.
All right, Zoe Redders, this is all day long. We've been reading punditry and analysis and articles. Everyone asking, do these men have more in common, or are they very different, Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron? Obviously, the age is different. The outlook on the world is different. But actually, do they have a lot in common as well?
Well, I mean, the foreign media recently has definitely shown a lot of has compared Trump and Macron in an interesting way, because I think that's how Macron needs to be careful not to, overplay his hand by being too friendly with Trump, because his image can suffer from that, his image internationally. And we've seen comparisons, so you can see lists of different ways where Macron and Trump are supposedly the same, that they're political outsiders, that I think Newsweek called Macron a populist in his difficult relationship with media, just like Trump has a complicated relationship with media, micromanaging the economy, or things like that. So, maybe they do. According to the international press, they do.
George A. Kuzmanovic, what were your thoughts when you saw the two of them up there together?
I see that Macron's bet failed. He has a bit the style of Sarkozy. I think he can, just because himself can solve everything, and convince Donald Trump to come back to the COP21, the Paris Climate Agreement, and Trump didn't. I just said I will not. So it was very polite.
He said, we'll see what happens.
Yes, but it's just they are making a press conference. It's very polite. It's a no. That's it. So Macron just simply didn't succeed in what he thought it was possible.
Was Emmanuel Macron right to invite Donald Trump to Paris?
I don't think so. Not on that day, not on the 14th, because it's. I understand that is 100 year after the commitment of the U.S. Army to help France, but you have a specific holiday for that. It's the 11th of November, and they could have waited for that. Tomorrow is the fest of the French Revolution against monarchy, against oligarchy, and here we have two representatives of the modern oligarchy, people that wants less regulation for the people, and in regard of what Mr. Trump represents is not the best day. But it's something, it's interesting because last April 2016, Mr. Valls and Hollande voted a law allowing 50 years after General de Gaulle banned them, the U.S. troops to come back on the French soil. So tomorrow will be the first parade of American troops back in Paris after 50 years.
So it was actually NATO troops, and it was only a formality. But just to go back on this, it was actually decided in 2016, I think, that the American president, that the American president was going to be invited, whether it was going to be Clinton or Trump, and Macron elected didn't really, I mean, it's not a gesture, it's not an endorsement from Macron to Trump. It was decided before that. So, no, really. I mean, it was. I think
it's a wonderful thing. I really think it's timely. I think it's exceptional, and I think the fact that American troops are going to lead the parade down the Champs-Élysées and the Thunderbirds are going to fly over is a reaffirmation of 240 years of being allies. I think it's a very, very positive thing rising up underneath a confrontational current situation.
Max Paulsen?
Absolutely. I mean, just the fact that, and you see Trump referring to Lafayette. I often think that this is how he learns his history, by reading his talking points and discovering historical figures that way. And he says, oh, well, many people don't know the role that France played in the American. So he's learning.
Many Americans
and he's,
don't actually.
It's well, there's a lot about our history that we could be better educated about. Except to say that I think that Macron struck the right tone in saying, regardless of the current occupants of these offices, we have to respect that history. It nous dépasse. It goes beyond us. And I think Trump had at least the minimum good grace to agree.
190 troops from the U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force will be marching alongside thousands of French troops on Bastille Day. U.S. planes will contribute to the grand fly past. These images were from early Monday morning on the Champs-Élysées. They did their rehearsal. U.S. forces participating.
My great-grandfather served here as part of the 8th Evacuation Hospital. He was a German-American, and yes, it's extremely great to be here in order to kind of honor and commemorate his memory and the memory of so many of the others that served in the war.
In 1917, when 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment actually came to Paris, they went on like a 5-mile march through Paris. They went to Marquis de Lafayette's tomb, and they shouted, "We are here." So we let the French know it's an enduring partnership.
George Kuzmanovic, you still think it's... I mean, their foreign troops have often marched in Paris on Bastille Day. It's not just...
Sorry, some of them were German, weren't they? And uninvited.
No, but in past years, foreign forces are often invited. So why not Americans, especially on this 100th anniversary?
Well, from our point of view, you know that we are against the presence of France in NATO. So American troops is very particular. And we have to remind that it's not the average country. It's the strongest country in the world, the largest military budget. And it means something for a country that represented some kind of independence and a link between different parts of the world. To have American troops is not. No, I have nothing. Once again, I fought with them. So I have nothing against the military, the American military troops. They could have come the 11th of November to parade in Paris for this occasion because they came to help us when we were at war with Germany. But here is completely different. It's a political gesture of showing who's the boss, and France is under the United States. This is completely clear now since Sarkozy. and now Macron after Hollande.
It's not the first time U.S. troops have marched on the Champs-Élysées on Bastille Day. U.S. forces invited in commemoration of the 1917 decision to enter World War I. They entered the war in April of 1917, but took time to train the forces, bring them over, and they'd only been in France 2 weeks when they marched in that year's Bastille Day parade. Yes, these are images from 1917. And Lex Paulson, when you look at these pictures, this was a real time of change for the United States. It had tried to stay out of the war, but then when it entered, it's changed for good. America's standing on the world stage.
You know, before World War I, America was not even in the top echelon of military powers in the world, and it often is looked at as a mistake. In fact, over the 4th of July weekend in the U.S., I get in this historical debate with my dad, who was convinced that America intervening in World War I is what ultimately caused World War II, and that. But there's nothing to be denied that this partnership and especially that symbolism that the soldier evoked of going back to Lafayette's tomb and saying that in times of real emergency, we are sister republics, and we in America owe our independence and our existence to that commitment on behalf of our French allies. I think it's worth once in a while, no matter who's in the White House, it's worth once in a while remembering that.
But of course, it also comes in the context of the G20, which took place just 1 week ago. And there was the sense that the pendulum was swinging when it came to how the United States sees itself on the world stage, and that it's sort of retreating from that leadership role. Perhaps not on military matters.
No, I understand what you're saying.
But more on issues such as trade, such as fighting environmental problems.
I have a very different take on what Trump is trying to do, which is not to really step back from global leadership, but rather to refocus on making sure that we get things right in the U.S. And I'll take the Paris Accords as an example and just suggest that if you look at any of those, if you look at those accords with any sense as an American, they're grossly out of balance. America was supposed to, if I've got my numbers right, achieve a 30% reduction in emissions, in carbon emissions by 2025 or something like that. Well, India and China were not even going to make an effort until 2030. They had no obligations whatsoever. And I think if you look, I'll lay this down. Republicans are not anti-climate. If you look at the trend lines in America, we have an unbroken 45-year track record of improving air and water quality. It's not as though we're playing games with the climate for the sake of growing the economy. What we're trying to do right now under President Trump is rectify some of the crazy regulation that happened under Obama that is damaging, horribly damaging to economic growth.
I'm sorry, I just have to correct one very critical point, which is to say the Paris Accords were built on voluntary commitments by almost every single country in the world, except for Syria and Nicaragua.
Except China and India, who got nothing.
That's absolutely untrue. Barack Obama negotiated with China the largest and most aggressive plan to fight
starting in 2030.
Well, look, China is not in the same position as America. But to imply that America is somehow bound because China and India.
Well, we're not bound. We're not going to do it.
But Trump lied to the American people and implied that America had gotten a bad deal, whereas America negotiated its own commitments.
No, Obama got us a bad deal, just like he got us a bad trade deal, just like TPP was a bad deal.
Tell that to your grandkids when they're living underwater.
Well, there you go.
I'm sorry, but we cannot push this. This is the kind of agreement we need to have in order to have a stable international.
I'll be honest. It's not about Republicans or Democrats. It's about the quality of the deal for the American people. Let's get a better deal, and that's what I think Trump said.
Well, we're now on our own.
But one of the big problems is the American way of life. There is a figure that
and the French way of life.
Yeah,
and the British way of life.
The worst one, if you may say, for the rest of the planet is the American. It's 4% of the population.
And 25% of the consumption and emissions.
That eats 40% of resources.
Not 40%.
Yes, we are 6%, we eat 30%. It's too much. Plus, you have 60%, 50% of the military budget. With all your NATO allies, you have 75%. That's too much. We use too much resources, and we have to cut it if we really want to have a world democracy. If not, well,
we don't want a world democracy.
You will have rich people.
We want multiple countries to have democracies. We don't want a global democracy.
Yes, but then you have to accept the fact that we will have rich people here in Western countries, with big armies and very poor people in the
10
rest of the
seconds.
world.
You have to look at you have to look at the trends globally of what capitalism has done for everyone. And this is not Africans. The third world is not suffering under capitalism. They're soaring.
Zoe Reynolds, let's get back just to that issue of the difference that was outlined. Some people described it as the G19+1, that summit in Hamburg last week. Is that fair to say that the United States is isolated to that point when it comes to not just climate change, but also issues such as trade?
There's definitely a pattern of isolation, and it's what I think is quite interesting in Macron's reaction to this. That I remember when I came back from DC in February, right after the elections, there was such a state of shock that there was no constructive policy to be made, including from the French representatives over there and representatives. And now I feel like Macron is really seizing the opportunity of Trump's unpredictable character. And that's something that he seems to have found, and maybe not the other international countries for now. What I mean by that is when you're so unpredictable, it's also that you don't really have a conscience of the history or what lies behind some agreements or some questions which are completely frozen. So although on the climate issue, it seems that he's not really going to get his way, Macron may be able to unfreeze some things which would have been unimaginable. It reshuffles the cards completely.
I think it's absolutely right. He's doing the world a great service right now and should be given some credit, because what can France ask for from America, given that the trade stance and the climate stance are fait accompli at this point? Well, it's what you say. It's making Trump's unpredictability a little bit less threatening for the sake of world order and world peace. And the fact that we're going to see this wonderful military parade tomorrow, and Trump is going to recognize in France that France is one of the military forces to be reckoned with in the Middle East, in Libya, and potentially elsewhere. I think that could be a force for stability in a time that we definitely need some.
Yeah, there's a subcontext to this, Georgie, which is the U.S. trying to get the Americans to get on board to help patrol the Sahara Desert. And so far, the Americans have not committed to that yet. This new G5 plan that they've put forth. And also, there was that question from the American journalist during the press conference, which he answered in English when he was asked about Russia. And he played it quite coy, Emmanuel Macron. He didn't lambast Vladimir Putin at that point. Did you think he answered correctly?
It's a press conference. He's president of France. As he said, I think he cannot make any other answer. But I'm surprised that the journalists are not asking the same question when they're speaking about Saudi Arabia or when they meet people from AIPAC, because there is some relation that are very close with the U.S. politicians that looks okay. And it doesn't look okay when it's Russia or China. Well, it's a bit bizarre. But I would like to come back to your first question, was to Zoe. Trump looks like the bad guy, but it's just the caricature of what the United States are doing usually. I mean, the United States didn't sign the Kyoto Agreement. Trump wasn't there. They didn't sign the anti-personnel mine agreement, even though it was an American woman who received the Nobel Prize to fighting against those weapons. They did sign the agreement on chemical weapons, but they still have the capability to do it, to make them, and they still have stocks of chemical weapons. They didn't sign the agreement on children's, and they refused the International Court of Justice. So you have a long tradition of U.S. policy refusing to sign international agreements. So Trump, from my point of view, is just continuing that trend in a way that is a little bit with buffoonery, I may say, but nothing new.
Can I add one fact? America spends more on international development, on food aid, on aid to young entrepreneurs in Africa, in fighting malaria and fighting HIV than almost any other country in the world, and deserves to be given some credit for playing a positive role as well as sometime an isolationist role.
That's true as well. But regarding economic growth, it's Cuba is doing the best help to Africa. Regarding economic growth,
sending all that sugar.
It's 5,000 doctors.
Let's listen to the French president when he answered in English regarding the Russian meddling and how he would handle Vladimir Putin under such circumstances? Or actually, if I recall correctly, the question was, how would he handle the Russians?
Yes, to answer your question, I will not interfere in U.S. domestic policy, and I think it's always good between partners and allies not to interfere in the other's domestic life.
What a good answer that is.
Zoe Renners, of course, everybody was waiting at that press conference for the question to Donald Trump, because it was the first time he'd spoken publicly about that email chain involving his son and a Russian lawyer. So let me ask you from a communications consultant point of view, how did Macron, how did Trump do when it came to that thorny question?
Macron or
both?
Because Macron was perfect, I think. I mean, it's not his role to meddle into international politics, foreign politics. But I mean, Trump was Trump. I mean, he just, gives us a little insight on the fact that lawyer indeed was not maybe not working for the government, but only a Russian lawyer. Then he tells us something about Flynn approving this woman's visa. I'm so sorry. Lynch approving her visa. Then he says that anyone would have done this in this situation, which is not exactly like the way president usually speaks. So.
No, and all I had to do was see the stream of Republicans this week who said, I've worked, people who worked on dozens and dozens of campaigns.
Those aren't Republicans. Those are what we call rhinos in the U.S. Those are people who are afraid of Donald Trump because their position in Washington, D.C. is...
That's fine. Then name me one person who ever took research from a foreign power.
It just feels like it's House of Cards.
Name me one.
Hillary Clinton.
No, did she?
Yeah.
Well, then, I don't
The
see any
DNC
proof
for Hillary Clinton was in Ukraine looking up dirty work on Donald Trump.
I'd love to see some evidence of that.
It's public. It's commonly accepted. It's widely known. You only don't know about it because the U.S. media doesn't talk about it. Therefore, the French media doesn't know. By the way, do any of you know who Alan Dershowitz is? A hard left, liberal, nutcase Harvard lawyer.
The most extreme right on Israel that you've ever heard in your life.
He's a very liberal guy, and he says, to be honest with you, there's no there. There's no crime. Even if everything they said about Donald Jr. was true, and everything. Collusion is not a crime, and it wasn't collusion because he didn't succeed. He could have taken information from them, and it still wouldn't be collusion because he would have had to hack it or given them help hacking it. This is the most nutcase thing that the media is doing, and it is just trying to destroy the Trump presidency, and it's not going to work.
There is one very funny thing is to look at the cover of Time magazine a few months ago, saying Putin was involved in the election in the United States. How bad it is with the figure of Putin like that. Okay, but you have a Time magazine cover from '96 saying how American councillors helped to re-elect Boris Yeltsin in Russia. So it's funny. Maybe the Russians have been involved in the U.S. election.
Not to forget
I have no idea.
The $300,000 of U.S. money that Obama spent to try and defeat Bibi Netanyahu. Okay.
We will see what Trump will do. I think it's a long trend of U.S. policy to be involved in a lot of foreign
And so you agree with Donald Trump that you would have taken that meeting?
Of course you would.
I'm not sure because we don't.
You have a chance to get dirt on Hillary Clinton in the middle of an election. Of course you do.
I've worked for 4 presidential campaigns. You do not accept Oppo research from a foreign power, especially not an adversary. It's not
Hillary
done.
Clinton did. Okay.
Show me some evidence, and I'll maybe.
Do a little homework. I'm not going to Google things for you.
I wasn't going to say fake news tonight, but there it is. Anyway.
No, it's not fake.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
This is proven news, by the way.
All right, lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. This one not too clement for the U.S. president. Appreciate Macron trying, but between the Koch brothers, coal jobs, pipelines, and GOP climate denial, no way Trump changed his mind on Paris Accord. Of course, there was also this one point during the press conference where Trump said that he praised Emmanuel Macron for wanting to cut down on government bureaucracy. What did you make of that, Zoe Renners? Is that
well, I think it just stands for Macron's recent tax and fiscal initiatives, but it's also the way I think that's interesting is the way Trump speaks about this. He definitely has his little keynotes and says, okay, there was something that happened these past 2 days in France. You need to just put this in there. So I don't think it really has a lot of deep. I mean, I think he added after that they should do it in the US too. I mean, it's difficult, to be honest, to answer, and also your question before, it's difficult to analyze also from a French perspective how Trump communicates, because frankly, it's ununderstandable. For me, it's so
he said
not
at one point,
presidential
we
that
did not become great through regulation, is what Donald Trump said. Is that the way do you understand that he and Macron are on the same page when it comes to that?
Again, I really have a hard time understanding what really lies beneath. Maybe.
Well, here's what's going on. What's going on is that he's had now several months in office with no legislative accomplishments. The only thing he can point to as president is that, well, we've rolled back executive orders, because that was the thing he can do directly as president, including executive orders protecting the environment and on all kinds of other issues relating to progressive priorities, and so this is the only victory he can point to. And so in associating Macron with his very paltry record of accomplishments, that was sort of the best Trump could do in the moment. And Macron does stand for more efficiency in government, but is not standing for rolling back protections on the environment in the way Donald Trump has. And frankly, he should be ashamed of doing that.
Well, he cut $4 billion and a lot of money in the environment ministry. Also military. I don't know if Mr. Trump is happy with that, because he's asking 2% GDP growth in military expenses, and Mr. Macron just cut 850 million in the military expenses.
He's pledged to increase it until 2019.
Yes, but now it's a cut. We'll see the increase.
Right. There was at one point, and again, it's about positioning yourself on the world stage. It was a question by a Chinese journalist asking both leaders what they thought of Xi Jinping. And this is on the day, of course, when Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo has died after being released while being terminally ill with liver cancer. Neither leader brought that up.
Yeah, it's too bad.
What do you think? What is the role of France now going forward in this world where the United States is rethinking its own position?
Well, I would sincerely hope. I mean, if any rational person, and certainly somebody with a military background, any rational person has to look at the issues we face with North Korea and say that they're essentially untenable. I mean, there is no good option there unless General Mattis has something up his sleeve that can take out those artillery units that can destroy Seoul in 30 seconds. I think that any country in the world that does not find the right mindset to try to put pressure on both Russia and China, because they both have influence on North Korea, to make something happen is just leading us into a very, very bad place. I
agree entirely with my colleague on this point, but I would return to what you said about world democracy. I think you can only look at the two major crisis points in the world, or the two worst dictatorships under Syria and North Korea, and the fact is that horrific, monstrous dictatorships like the dictatorship in North Korea and in Syria cannot coexist with democracies. Either the world will become all one thing or another, but a house divided itself against itself. I don't see that as world democracy.
I agree with you fully, but I don't see that as a question of global democracy. I think that is a question of every democracy recognizing that that's untenable.
Georgi Kuzmanevich, should Emmanuel Macron have mentioned Liu Xiaobo in his answer?
Yes, but first you have to be clean hands before speaking of others. And I'm surprised that no journalist asked them about Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest ally.
But that's a different issue. There's a lot of countries that violate human rights. But
there is a
my question was, should he have?
They should say something about that, even if it's an internal policy. But we are best-selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is a big ally of the United States, and these guys are doing the worst actual war,
I agree with you.
Far worse than what is happening in Syria, in Yemen.
I agree.
And the population is starving. If we read the United Nations reports, it's 15 million people that are on threat of hunger.
Where is that?
Yemen.
Yemen.
When there is a war led by Saudi Arabia, and Trump went there and said nothing about it. Macron is saying nothing about it. Even worse, Trump start to make problems with Qatar, which will be another issue. And I would have also surprised because we are allies, and there was no questions about what the Trump administration will do with the NSA scandal, because on the last presidency, our president was listened by our ally, which is a big problem.
And actually, I think that's one of the things when you were asking what, the comparison between Putin and Trump, I think between Macron and Trump, one thing that is obvious is their kind of unclear way of positioning themselves towards Putin, towards Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all the hot subjects right now.
Because at the G20, there was the sense that, in some ways, some were saying that Angela Merkel had become this sort of leader of the free world. Of course, Germany doesn't have a big military. With Trump sort of relegating some of the role, is Emmanuel Macron taking that mantle? How does it work?
Obama was definitely kind of relying on Merkel to handle Europe. It seems right now that with Angela Merkel's, comments at the G20 saying that Germany could not rely in the same way, I believe that's what she said, on the U.S. Now maybe there's a new
I think she was the disappearing.
I
think she was the disappearing woman. I thought she completely fell off the international stage at the G20.
No, but she's in the midst of elections, and she has other issues, and she's also being attacked, I think, domestically for being too easy on Trump, on Erdogan, etc. So she's toughening her positions on the international scene, and maybe it's not the right time for her to be in the best diplomatic spot.
So does Macron take the spotlight, is the question?
Well, he seems to be doing that and doing it quite well.
That's what Trump's trying to do right here, I believe.
No, I think but the real support is of the United States is Germany, and the deployment of U.S. troops is through Germany. The U.S. command of the troops that are deployed in the Eastern Europe is in Germany. So no, I think for the Secretary of State, Germany is the leading, at least in Europe. Macron is doing good communication, but all right.
And it's interesting. Sorry, it's interesting. She was here today, this morning. Like you can't.
Yeah, they had that joint cabinet meeting just before leaving. One final question: will this visit to Paris change Donald Trump in any way?
I think it's interesting. You saw on the Paris Climate Accord answer him leaving a little bit of daylight. Oh, we'll see, because Trump has no policy commitments. He just has moments. And this was a moment of where you said the word great leader over and over again, great, tremendous, great.
Well, that's why he and Macron are so good together, because neither of them have a defined policy position.
We had a 30-page policy program that we're in the process of.
Good. I'm glad about that.
But the point is, I think you'll see Trump being a little bit less rigid with regard to his confrontations with France and Europe at this point on.
All right,
pragmatists.
We'll leave it there for now. Lex Paulson, I want to thank you. Georgi Kuzmanovic. I also want to thank Stuart Haugen and Zoe Renners.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.